Szóval engem Udvarhelyi Tesszának hívnak, én vagyok ennek a konferenciának most itt a házigazdája, és egyébként a Közélet Iskolája egyik alapítója vagyok. Nagyon örülünk, hogy ilyen sokan eljöttetek, és hogyha nem baj, akkor én mostantól tegeződésre fogok átváltani. Ez a Közélet Iskolájás képzéseken mindig így szokott lenni, és hát ez olyan, mintha egy nagy képzésen lennénk, úgyhogy folytatom ezt a hagyományt. És egy pár ilyen szervezési, meg technikai dolgot mondanék el, mielőtt belevágunk a Közös hatalmunk konferenciába. Egyrészt, hogyha a programra kíváncsi valaki, akkor azt a közéletiskolája.hu oldalon meg lehet nézni, vagy pedig a Közélet Iskolája Facebook oldalán, de fent a regisztrációnál kinyomtatva is azt hiszem, hogy osztottunk programot, illetve oda is ki van vetítve, szóval nem lehet nem észrevenni. Ezt a konferenciát a Közélet Iskolája szervezi, és a támogatást hozzá a Faith in Action nevű szervezet adja, és ezen kívül még fontos elmondani, hogy a konferencia fővédnöke Karácsony Gergely főpolgármester, aki majd délután fog is idejönni egy beszélgetésre. Fönt a regisztrációnál lehet kapni közéletiskolájás kiadványokat, könyveket, illetve információt lehet kapni a tevékenységünkről, képzéseinkről. Köszönjük, hogyha támogattok minket azzal, hogy vásároltok könyveket, ez a munkánkat nagyon nagyban segíti. Ami még fontos, hogy a segítők, akik a szervezők, ők egy ilyen egyenpólóban vannak, ami nagyon szép kék, és van rajta egy nagyon szép közéletiskolájás logó, szóval, hogyha segítségre van szükségetek, akkor őket keressétek nyugodtan, ők mindenre fognak tudni válaszolni. Ami még fontos, hogy minden beszélgetésnek a nagyobb része az itt a színpadon fog folyni, de az utolsó 15 perc az mindig a közönség kérdéseké lesz, úgyhogy nektek is lesz lehetőségetek hozzászólni, kérdezni, véleményt mondani. Ezen kívül még fontos, hogy a Facebookon is megy egy élő közvetítés, a YouTube-on és a Facebookon is megy élő közvetítés, úgyhogy akik az élő közvetítést követik, őket is szeretettel köszöntjük, bár fogalmam sincs hol a kamera, de nagyon örülünk nektek is, és hogyha bármi problémát érzékeltek a hanggal vagy a közvetítéssel, akkor arra kérjük, hogy kommenteljetek a Facebook eseményhez, és akkor tudunk róla, és megpróbáljuk ezt orvosolni. És akkor áttérnék a tolmácsolásra, tehát mivel ez egy nemzetközi konferencia, és itt vagyunk Magyarországon, ezért az alapszabály, hogy mindenki azon a nyelven beszél, amin kényelmesnek érzi. Alapvetően angol és magyar tolmácsolásunk van, úgyhogy arra kérünk mindenkit, hogy ezen a két nyelven próbáljon meg megnyilvánulni. Bármelyiken meg lehet, és senki ne izguljon, vagy szóval, hogy nem kínos, hogyha tolmácsgépet kell használni, azért vannak itt a tolmácsok, hogy mindenkinek segítsenek. A tolmácsgépeket bármikor át lehet venni, és le lehet adni fönt a regisztrációnál. Az fontos, hogy ne hagyjátok itt a személyiteket, amit leadtatok cserébe a fülesért, úgyhogy ne sétáljatok ki a fülessel, mert akkor egyrészt ne vigyétek el a füleseket, másrészt meg akkor nem lesz nálatok a személyitek. Szóval mielőtt elhagyjátok az épületet, mindenképpen adjátok le a fülest, és kérjétek vissza a személyit. Ide van nekem írva, hogy hogyan működik ez a füles, de én sajnos nem tudom, mert nem próbáltam ki, de hogy mondjam el, hogy hogyan működik, úgyhogy nagyon remélem, hogy mindenki kitalálta, hogy hogyan működik. És akkor még egyszer elmondom, hogy a magyar nyelvű szövegeket az 1-es csatornán, az angol nyelvű szövegeket a 2-es csatornán lehet hallgatni, nem kell váltogatni, tehát hogy a tolmácsok váltogatják, úgyhogy ha valaki eredetileg tehát, ha valaki a magyarra állítja, akkor bármilyen nyelven is beszélünk itt, ő mindig a magyar nyelvű szöveget fogja hallani. És akkor még annyi, hogy aki online követi az eseményt, ők viszont csak az eredeti hangot hallják, tehát ott nincs tolmácsolás, úgyhogy amikor kevert nyelven beszélünk itt a színpadon, ami most is például elő fog fordulni, akkor ők mindig azt a nyelvet fogják hallani, amin mi beszélünk. Akkor még ilyen... Igen, nagyon fontos kérés, hogy kávét ne hozzatok be ebbe a terembe, vagy ha behoztok, azt csak tetős pohárral tegyétek. Ezt megköszönjük, hogyha erre figyeltek. Ami még fontos, hogy a mosdó az itt van hátul, egy picit sétálni kell, tehát hogy itt lent is van, illetve a regisztráción, tehát a földszintnek az emeletén a büfénél van. És arra is kérünk mindenkit, hogyha valaki véletlenül nem regisztrált, akkor tegye meg, hogy lássuk, hogy hányan vagyunk, illetve hogyha valaki kért szállást, vagy utazási támogatást tőlünk, akkor azt szintén a regisztrációnál tudja elintézni, úgyhogy ha ezt még nem tette, akkor kérjük, hogy majd a szünetben menjetek föl, és ezt intézzétek el. És akkor ezek voltak az ilyen technikai technikai részei ennek a bevezetőnek, és akkor még egyszer mindenkit szeretettel köszöntünk, és most átavanzsálok moderátorrá, mert az első beszélgetést azt én moderálom, és ennek az első beszélgetésnek a témája az, hogy hogyan történik a rendszerváltás, és hogy mi a civil szerveződések és társadalmi mozgalmak szerepe a különböző rendszerváltásokban. Itt különböző példákat fogunk hallani, hogy mit is jelent az, hogy rendszerváltás. És 3 vendégünk van itt, mellettem ül Sebály Bernadett, aki a CEU Demokrácia Intézetének kutatója. Köszi, hogy itt vagy. Ő mellette ül Grigory Frolov, aki a Free Russia Foundation, tehát a Szabad Oroszország Alapítvány alelnöke, és Alejandra Gomez, aki pedig a Living United for Change in Arizona, egy arizonai Egyesült Államokbeli szervezetnek a társ-ügyvezető igazgatója, és majd ők még sokkal részletesebben el fogják mondani, hogy mivel foglalkoznak, mert hogy az első kérdésem hozzájuk bocsánat, át kell raknom egy másik papírt. Szóval, hogy arra kértem őket, hogy az első részében ennek a beszélgetésnek egy kicsit mutassák be azt a szervezetet, meg azt a munkát, amit ők végeznek, és arra kérlek titeket, hogy mondjátok el, hogy ez a munka hogyan kapcsolódik az autoriter rendszerek, vagy tekintélyelvű rendszereknek a lebontásához, megváltoztatásához. Úgyhogy ha oké, akkor a Bettivel kezdenénk.
Így hallotok? Okay, so I'm Hungarian, but I decided to speak in English because I think it's important that we can interact in the panel. So I hope that's okay for everyone. I am a community organizer and an educator, and I'm doing my PhD at the Central European University in public policy. And the formative experience that made me political was the effort that I joined in 2009 to build a poor people's organization, a poor people's housing organization in Hungary. That organization, called the Cities for All, was an organization of homeless people, people living in housing insecurity, and people like me, allies who were not directly impacted by housing insecurity. And we together were fighting for the right to housing and more affordable housing in Hungary. And this organization was the catalyst of the Hungarian housing movement for almost a decade. And I was part of the effort for 8 years, and during those 8 years, I learned how to organize. And during those 8 years, I also learned that marginalized groups have a specific role in replacing autocratization, and that it's not enough to take down authoritarian regimes and returning to a status quo. It's very important that we go beyond that status quo, and in this project to reclaim democracy, we assign a central role to the equal distribution of rights, resources, and participation. And drawing on this organizing experience, I played a leadership role through the Civil College Foundation to build and promote the practice of organizing in Hungary, which is a social change approach to bring ordinary people into politics and building grassroots power. And during those years, I had a first-hand experience of the dilemma that I'm sure that a lot of activists and organizers who work in an authoritarian context encounter, the dilemma whether it is enough to fight for issues, it is enough to fight an authoritarian regime through policy change, and when does the point come when we should fight against the regime and run an explicitly anti-regime campaign. In the middle of this work, the Orbán regime became more and more repressive through smear campaigns and legal means against civic organizations which were critical of their policies. And it culminated in a legislation in 2017 which stigmatized NGOs and which constrained their room of maneuver, their work in Hungary. And this anti-NGO legislation was akin to the Russian anti-NGO legislation. And I was a coordinator in 2017 of a broad-based coalition called Civilizáció, which was fighting against this anti-NGO legislation, which was eventually redrawn a few years later. And this experience inspired me to work on shifting the culture of how civic organizations relate to elections, and thinking about how civic organizations could relate more strategically to the electoral moment. And I was designing and leading training together with the School of Public Life on how to relate to elections more strategically. And then I started my PhD, and my field of research is the policy impact of social movements, and I'm interested in how different movement strategies complement each other in a movement infrastructure, and how that can potentially increase the impact of social movements. And through the CEU Demokrácia Intézet, I participate in a social democracy project, which together with the School of Public Life provides a tool for movement activists to construct a narrative of their social movement history. So this is what I bring to this debate, an organizer and a researcher mindset.
Hi everyone, my name is Grigory Frolov and I represent the, I think it is, yeah? Yeah, good. And I represent the Free Russia Foundation. That's an institution which was founded in 2014 outside of the Russia by the group of exiled Russians, as in 2014 the first iteration of Russian-Ukrainian war began. And it was a moment when a lot of people was forced to flee. When I say a lot of people, we thought then that it was a lot of people, like because amount of people who fled Russia after the beginning of the full-scale invasion is now counted from 1 to 2 million, and a lot of this includes the key journalists, the key political and civic activists, and people who actually was trying to build the civil society that, I don't know, dozen years before 2022. Free Russia does a couple of things, but the key of them are, first of all, helping people to flee and then adapt to the new reality where they are, meaning assisting in transitional models and overcoming the issues of relocation fast, so people can continue do investigating journalism, continue do human rights work, continue outreaching their messages to their constituencies back in Russia while they're already in Georgia, in Germany, in Estonia, wherever else, as that's unfortunately how the Russian civil society operates right now. The second thing is we play as a think-do organization, meaning we produce a lot of analytics and we advocate for sanctions. I'm merging these two things because they are very close to each other. On one side, we advocating for effective sanctions, and we are writing the roadmaps for which we're happy to share with the Western states on how to hit on the Putin regime more effective. But then on another side, we also monitor and analyze what's happening after that, how the economy goes after that, or whether those sanctions actually working or being effective. One of the reports we recently published was a report based on the data of import of the different goods to Russia, which we've been monitoring for a while. So we was analyzing which states are continuing to, or through which state borders Russia continuing to receive, for example, elements on which they built new missiles or drones or everything else they use for continuing the war. And this is a big part of our work, be a voice of the democratic Russians abroad, so the sanctions and the actions of other states against the current Putin regime would be more effective. The third thing we do is missions on accountability for the war criminals, as unfortunately right now we are fighting not just against a dictatorship or authoritarian state or the human rights abusers. Our enemy right now are the war criminals, which started the first and largest genocidal war in Europe in many years, and they act in the same way inside of the country as people who are continuing to fight against the regime inside of the country and against the war right now are at risk not to be put in jail for 30 days, but under risk to be put in jail for 10 years, 25 years, as one of my former colleagues, Vladimir Karamurza, who is right now serving a 25 years long sentence in jail for his anti-war position and affiliation with an undesirable organization. Yeah, we are undesirable organization, Russia. Hello. And so we are monitoring the war crimes. We are communicating with institutions like ICC and UN bodies which are covering the war crimes and abuse of human rights, and we trying to catch as much of information as we can, so the people who right now represent the current Russian regime could be accountable after they fail, or once they could be catched somewhere around the world, so they won't be able to to travel freely, for example. Those are the three things. The second and the third are about working with complicated issues and the states and institutions. The first one is about people and about how we can provide services for those who are active, for those who are brave, who are continuing their work in any situation of risk or different kind of personal situations when they have to run from country to country every time. For those people, we currently organized 5 resource centers in different places, in Georgia, in Estonia, and Lithuania, in Germany, and soon we're going to have one on Balkans, where we provide working space, studios to broadcast, different kind of legal and psychological services, so people can stay calm and continue their operations. We provide fellowships, capacity building programs, acceleration programs, so the people who already know how to work and who already have a constituency inside of the country and the regions, they just can continue operating. And for those who are just joining the movement, who need skills, who need techniques, who need a startup funding, for those we provide what they need.
Thank you. Köszönöm. Akkor most Kelet-Európa után átmegyünk egy másik kontinensre, úgyhogy nézzük meg, hogy Alex mivel foglalkozik, és ez hogyan kapcsolódik a rendszerváltásokhoz.
Why isn't Arizonan here? I'm so honored to be here with you all. We've had the pleasure of, meeting with community activists, also with your mayors, and it's been really incredible to see the parallels many of your struggles are very similar to the struggles that we're fighting back home. And so what brought me into the work is actually my father was undocumented. And we lived in California when the government in California began to target undocumented communities. And so there were raids in the workplace. And so my father decided that rather than get detained and deported, sent back to Mexico, that we were going to leave. And so we came to Arizona thinking that everything was going to get better, that we were going to have the American dream that my parents, you know, really had fought for. And what we quickly realized is that bad policymakers, you can't run from them. You have to stay and fight. And so in Arizona's context, you know, what is very clear to us now is that we had Trump before Trump came into office. Arizona was a testing ground for a Trump to be able to take office. So they began to test the rhetoric. They began to test the policies and how to target communities that were at the margins that did not have political influence. And so the story of Arizona, and that's where my story started, and my fight started with a sheriff that was our Trump before Trump was elected into office. But he was sort of the test pilot to create a Trump moment in 2016 in the United States. And so really Arizona's story begins in 1848 when the Mexican-American War ended. There were Mexican-American communities and immigrants that were stripped of their land, that were stripped of their titles, that were stripped of their deeds. And now you have communities that once owned land, that owned homes, that are now without status and have no political or economic influence. So you begin to see that the system and all of these terrible politicians were creating a underclass and marginalizing communities that were not white men. So if you fast forward to the Great Depression, what then starts to happen is that the Mexican-American community further begins to get scapegoated. And so in the Arizona context, the Mexican community begins to be blamed for the job loss. They're taking our jobs, they're stealing our resources, much like a lot of the conversation that we've heard here, right? It becomes the dehumanizing of people that then allows for these regimes to begin to chip away at their humanity and take hold. So in 2004, Sheriff Arpaio is elected into office. And when that happens, he is touted as the toughest sheriff in America. And so he makes it a point and his mission to go and hunt immigrants. And so we begin to see the same things that were happening, the things that my family left in California, which were workplace raids. If you were crossing the street or you were driving in a car, often there were sheriffs there waiting, and they were ready to ask you for your papers. And if you weren't a citizen, they would take you, detain you, and then deport you. So many families, you know, were waiting for their loved ones to get home, and the parents never made it. And so now you have 14-year-olds, 15-year-olds that are raising their baby siblings because the parents were deported. So what then myself and a group of other young leaders, at the time I was young, I'm not so young anymore, we begin to actually do protests we began doing direct action to expose what Sheriff Arpaio was doing at the time. And what then happens is the right digs in more, and they ran a governor for office that within the first few months of her getting elected, she passes what is called SB 1070, and that is the Show Me Your Papers law. So now it allows not only the sheriff, but it also allows for police to look for people that were driving vehicles that looked like Mexicans would drive that car. Clothing that would make you look like you were a Mexican because it was a silky shirt or you had a Virgin Mary on the back. Any religious sort of Catholic images that would clue police officers to stop those people, detain them, and deport them. And so our movement in Arizona actually started from individual people like you all here that rather than succumb to the fear, decided that we were going to take the risk and we were going to do direct action. That we were going to go to the epicenter of where all of this fear was happening, which was at the Arizona State Capitol, and we were going to stand our ground, so to speak. And we stayed there, we organized, but what we also realized is that those 100 years of oppression of our communities not voting, not participating because no party system actually went to register our communities to vote, to talk to them about getting involved, to vote for candidates, then led to us going and doing that work. So our organization not only emerged out of that fire, because there were no other organizations really, maybe there were 3. Now there's over 50 organizations probably in the state. And we built a coalition that helped us build also political power and civic engagement to register people to vote. And so that in that time we went from SB 1070, the Show Me Your Papers law with a Republican supermajority and a authoritarian Sheriff Arpaio, Jan Brewer, and Russell Pierce, who was the author of SB 1070, to now we have a Democratic governor. This is all 12 years later. We have 2 Democratic senators. One of them is not great. We're working on getting rid of her. And we're 1 vote difference now within our state context. So change is possible, and that's why I'm so excited to be here with you all today. Sorry it took so long.
Thank you, and Alex will go into more detail about how that happened. But first now, in the second round of questions, we would... Magyarul, bocsánat. Fontos nekem, hogy most magyarul beszéljek, úgyhogy tényleg fogok erre figyelni. Szóval a kérdésem második köre az arra vonatkozik, hogy a társadalmi mozgalmaknak és civil szerveződéseknek milyen szerepe lehet az autoritár rendszerek lebontásában, úgyhogy most arra foglak titeket kérni, hogy egy kicsit menjetek a mélyre, és Grigorival kezdeném, tőle, hogyha hall engem. Jó? Szóval, hogy arra kérlek, hogy beszélj nekünk arról, hogy Oroszországban mely szervezetek, és hogyan dolgoznak azért, hogy az ország demokratikusan működjön, milyen nehézségekkel néznek szembe, és milyen lehetőségeik vannak. És nyilván azt már hallottuk, hogy ezeknek a szervezetek egy része fizikailag nem Oroszországban van, de hogyha tudsz arról beszélni, hogy Oroszországban belül, és azon kívül hogyan és mit csinálnak civil szervezetek, mozgalmak azért, hogy az ország demokratikussá váljon.
Thanks for this question, and I think it's really interesting that I am starting this conversation as I am representing basically a failed civil society on this point. But yeah, I think that would be a very different kind of answers, you know, on this question right now and 2 years ago, as the situation changed dramatically, and it started changing dramatically, even not in 2022, but in 2021, when the regime started basically initiated a huge crackdown on the multiple key and national-wide Russian political and civil society movements. Indeed, I think it's important to mention that cleaning up the Russian civic landscape was probably one of the key preparational steps before the full-scale invasion in Ukraine began. And it was an essential step for the regime to to maintain a safe path for beginning of the full-scale invasion. The situation which we have right now is that all the key leaders and key media outlets and most of the people who would be called oppositional or independent opinion makers are currently outside of the country or in jail. It's important not to forget about the second ones, as there was a number of brave people who decided that they won't leave, and that now they're basically communicating with the society from the jail cells, including Alexei Navalny, including Ilya Yashin, including Gorinov, and including a lot of people who actually won't be called opinion makers, but who decided to stay and who right now in the jails all around of the country. And before I'm gonna talk about those who are who are right now outside and what are the tactics for making activities from outside, it's important to mention that there are still people inside of the country, and I think that's more important. Those who are inside of the country are more important, and even they are not able right now to make a national-wide movement or anything like that, because it is really, really easy to get in jail right now, honestly. There are still, last year there was only, I think, 15 days when no one was in jail because of the public activity in Russian regions. That's basically a number. Doesn't mean that it was like a huge meetings or whatever, but it was different kinds of activities, from single person picketing to setting on fire conscript centers, which is also a way of non-violent activity and would be considered like that right now. And this is thing number one. There are still people inside, and they're important. The second thing is, yes, indeed, a lot of very professional the key professionals and a lot of institutionalized parts of civil society right now outside of the country and continuing operations. I think we can outline some particular activities which they can do. Number one is anti-propaganda and outreach to the country and to particular constituencies. And this is important. Right now, Russian YouTube generally is a very big phenomenon. So there is a huge amount of content produced in Russian language. A lot of people actually rather would watch YouTube than the TV channels. And when I'm saying that, I'm not talking about the youth people. I'm talking about people from very different generations. The difference would be that some people watch political broadcasting and other, culinary content. But still, huge amount of people in Russia are in YouTube. And a lot of key Russian influencers right now basically transformed in the YouTube video bloggers. This includes like key political people, key media outlets which was banned, whose websites was banned in Russia, but YouTube still operates. So they convert, say, content into videos and continue to broadcast. We say right now that this is, like a decentralized independent TV in Russia, which exists through multiple YouTube channels. Right now can outreach up to 30 million of unique users inside of the country, which is like 25% of the general population. That's a lot. That's some of the YouTube TV, some of the YouTube broadcasts are similar in the outreach and popularity to some, key propaganda TV shows broadcasted on the main public TV channels. And this is something important. This is the good news. Those channels are enlarging. They're able to outreach more and more people. And indeed, except for the national-wide YouTube channels, there are also a lot of local influencers, meaning local politicians from one or another town in Russia who was forced to flee and who continued broadcasting from outside to their particular constituency, which in many cases more effective, especially when this broadcast is not about some general information, but about things like how you can escape the army or how you can avoid the mobilization, because people are, generally have more trust in the local representatives and in local people rather than to some national-wide politicians, even it's oppositional politician or whoever else. This is thing number one. Thing number two, there is right now a huge movement or network of the helping organizations, meaning organizations who assist Russians who are trying to escape military service, and there are like hundreds of thousands of people who are continuing to flee the country, mostly not to Europe, as most of them don't have EU visas, but to Kazakhstan, to Georgia, to any other countries, any other visa-free countries. And this is a big issue. A lot of institutions right now are 100% engaged in trying to, basically save as many people as possible from mobilization. Those helping organizations are not only working for the, for assisting the Russians who are fleeing, but also to assisting Ukrainians who are fleeing. As a lot of Ukrainian citizens was forced to go to Russia from the occupied territories. That's a thing we call so basically those people just they only had a choice either to to stay in Mariupol under shelling or be forced to go to Russia. And there is and currently a lot of Russian helping organizations providing assistance to those people to escape Russia and via European borders go back to the country or to the refugee shelters. And this is also a big thing. And I mean, I know that this is maybe something, a topic on which we're going a little bit outside of regime change. But this is how the Russian civil society activity looks like right now. Because we are definitely not on a point where we can say that we are one step away from, from the shift in this regime. We are like such a great movement right now. But we are in a point when we are in a strong defense, and when we have to save, and when we have to save as many people as we can. And a huge part of activities of the Russian civil society or a movement right now are focused on these two key issues. First one, outreach, and second one, saving as many people as possible. And the third one, obviously, as we are, just 30 seconds. Yeah, and the third thing which we are focusing right now, and this time I'm saying as a movement, obviously we are talking a lot about people who are outside, is the advocacy, like a Europe-wide advocacy, national-wide advocacy on the places where people are localized right now to, to make more effective sanctions, to follow the Russian money, and there are a lot of Russian money in Europe, obviously. A lot of, Russian statesmen always thought that Russia is a country where they work but not where they live, right? So right now the situation for them changes. And this advocacy and accountability for the people affiliated with the state and for the war criminals is basically a third thing that people outside can do. Yeah, I think I'm gonna also mention one more issue, which is, I believe, important, and which is important in terms of our general conversation together with Arizona colleague. surprisingly or not surprisingly, the three groups which are the most active right now in Russia on the grassroots level are a woman organization and feminist organization, a youth organization, and organizations of ethnic minorities. As those groups are more or either, you know, the last who stays or the most affected by the war. And this is something which is important to mention, you know, in generally when we're trying to kind of, you know, analyze how we came to this situation, what are the possible points of growth. As right now the points of growth are the marginalized groups and the groups in the regions. As you know, as now they are somehow becoming, you know, more empowered in this situation, as you know, people who was representing elites, who was even oppositional elites, or who was representing the Moscow, right, the capital people, they was more public, so they has to flee first, right? But those who was in regions, those who was not like on the first pages of the journals, they had a little bit more time to regroup and continue operating in Russia, and this is important. And for example, in the Russian context, and I think this context is not only Russian, the state for many years tried to, you know, to take as much authority as possible, to steal as much rights from the people and from the regions as possible, and to put people who was in a marginalized situation in even more marginalized situation. So right now, when we're talking about any points of growth and any, you know, basement or foundation for regime change or for basically moving forward and pushing back, this is all about empowering the regions, empowering the marginalized groups, and empowering those who was in a disbalance of power for longer than anyone else. And this is, I think, something we need to outline.
Köszönöm, és akkor most Alexhez fordulunk, aki már említette, hogy Arizona, hogy ugye ők mondják, bekékült, szóval, hogy egy republikánus államból demokrata állammá vált, és az lenne a kérdésem, hogy ebben a rendszerváltásban, bizonyos értelemben, mi volt a szerepe a társadalmi mozgalmaknak és a civil szerveződéseknek? És hogyan történt ez az egész?
One thing that's very similar from the conversations that we've been here in Hungary is that the state, for a very long time, was divesting from our communities. And so that's the working class, working poor, communities of color in particular. And so there's this erosion, and every year the state would take away dollars for housing, for healthcare, for children, for education, and very similar. So on top of already the lack of resources, there's also now a sheriff that is targeting our communities. There is a Governor Jambrewer that was, enacting really racist policies to target specific groups, create fear, and elevate their political party and the conditions that they wanted to build. And so at that point, our organization was formed, and what became very clear to us is that this was being permitted, that it felt like there was a very real abandoning of people of color, particularly Latinos. At the time in 2010, there were about 400,000 eligible voters from the Latino community, and a small percentage of our communities were being registered to vote or asked to vote, while the state was also making it difficult for our communities to be able to participate in elections. They would send the wrong dates to the Latino community on when election day was. they would send information that did not make sense. So if it was in Spanish, people couldn't even read the information. To the point also where in Arizona you could vote by mail. What we learned very quickly is that also people that were sending in their ballots that had Latino surnames, their ballots were being thrown out. Right, so at every level, there's this systemic sort of oppression of our communities from being able to actually participate. And so our organization felt that it was both important to elevate the crisis, combat the rhetoric of dehumanizing communities of color, but Latino community in particular. Because you had the governor now saying that Mexicans were beheading people at the border, that we were raping people. And so, you know, there was this really big hill to climb around reminding people that we're hardworking, that we're not all of the things that, you know, these racist Republicans are saying. And so we had to change the rhetoric. We also had to build people power. The work actually started with people, and we needed to invite more people in to participate. And so that's when we actually, rather than allow the fear to take hold, what we started to do were house meetings. So we would go and host Know Your Rights at people's homes, and we would actually have to go outside into the yard because people were both so scared and wanted to find out how to fight back that we were, you know, hosting these massive meetings with hundreds of people in backyards. And so then that moment sort of translated also, those invitations came to go fight at the front door of all of these racist politicians. And so that was at the state capitol. And while we were there, we also knew that we, at the same time, had to build political power. So Lucha in this last election knocked on 550,000 doors statewide, because the fight when it initially started during SB 1070 was really concentrated in Phoenix. Very similar here to the context here in Budapest. But we had to spread out statewide if we wanted to really make gains in an electoral context. But for us, it was also really important to not make it about politicians, but to have authentic conversations with the real people that we were trying to engage year-round. And so that's really where the organizing continued. So the organizing that started around, you know, the fear, the hate, really started to take hold, and we started having broader conversations, and that's where the mission of our organization actually developed, is that folks were thinking of the attacks, they were challenged by what was happening in immigration, but they also could not put food on the table. They also needed affordable housing. And so for us, we started taking on these fights simultaneously to be able to address the additional concerns, plus to know your rights, to be able to have people understand how to protect themselves if immigration came knocking on their door, which immigration in our context was the police. And we also formed coalitions with emerging organizations that also wanted to begin to chip away at the challenges that we were having. And so the state for a very long time, for I would say the first 5 years, was in a defensive posture, fighting back all of the rhetoric, which was turning into policy, having to fight this policy, killing it at the state level. And then there was a moment where, with our membership, we used a referendum to be able to change the political context. The referendum really allowed us to begin to organize around wages for 3 years. And then there was a moment where we said, it's time, because everything is getting more expensive. our members are getting very anxious that we need to do this now. And so all of the conditions were for us to be able to, at the same time, when nobody thought that Trump was going to get elected into office, we ran a ballot measure to be able to increase the minimum wage. And so that was really when you began to see sort of like this switch in the politics happen in Arizona, where we won at the ballot measure, we got out Arpaio from office, so this racist sheriff is now gone, but Trump gets elected, and the first thing that Trump did when he went into office was he pardoned Arpaio for his crimes in Arizona. So then you begin to see, right, the signals to each other that they're going to have each other's back. And so that really prepared us for what we needed to continue to do, was continue building people power, continue to build base so that we can fuel these campaigns, but also begin to take on bigger and bigger electoral campaigns to begin to take out these people that are systemically oppressing the vote. That same year, we were able to remove Helen Purcell, who was the elections official that was throwing out the ballots, the election ballots of the ballots that had Latino surnames. And so we elected Adrian Fontes, who then became the county recorder that was now in relationship with us. So then you begin to see sort of this co-governing, which you all have very much so with the mayor from District 8, which is this relationship where you can actually negotiate power and you can move issues that matter to you to make access to your communities more real and bring real material change.
Mindjárt megyek a Bettire, csak még Alextől kérdezném, hogy ilyen konkrét számokban el tudod mondani, hogy az mit jelent, tehát hogy pontosan mikor és mi történt, mitől lett republikánusból demokrata, tehát hogy csak hogy értsük a helyzetet, tehát mit jelent az, hogy egy állam republikánusból demokratának, meg kiknek a személye változik, és hogyan?
It was 12 years in the making, so it was not overnight. We had to really build, organized groups of people in different parts of Arizona. We had to go into the rural communities. We had to stay within the urban corridors, the urban centers. And we had to do civic engagement work, so we had to register people to vote. We had to continue elevating the narrative, combating the rhetoric. One big sort of breakthrough moment also was when we were able to get DACA passed. So that was a protection for undocumented youth in the United States. All of the organizing that was done for that really gave a injection of momentum into the Arizona context, because a lot of these dreamers were also the dreamers that were going out and registering people to vote. Fighting for their parents to be able to have access and no longer be undocumented. And so you have this sort of long-term, we had a very long game. So for us, it was always sort of paying attention to the incremental victories. So we had to, Arpaio became sort of like the bad guy that we were all going after and doing actions around. And we were doing education around him because for all intents and purposes, SB 1070, the Show Me Your Papers law, is still in effect today. And so our communities could still, and are still being stopped and detained and deported. But what we turned all of that sort of into organizing. And so we'd never, every single year, we're ready for the fights at the legislature. We are going out and knocking on people's doors, talking about the issues that matter to them. So one of the big ones that we did through our organization is we're building a liberatory economy framework, because the economic situation in the United States, I know it's different, but it's very difficult. Inflation is very high, housing is very costly, and so our members keep telling us, right, that they can't really put food on the table, gas is too expensive, housing. And so we're having conversations, getting people involved, and we were actually able to deliver a significant victory in housing. Republicans had decimated the Housing Trust Fund, and now in this past election cycle, we were able to get an injection of $225 million. And so every step of the way, even though we're working toward the long term and doing the voter registration work, doing the direct action, working at the legislature, which is our state government, to enact the policies for our communities, we're also driving smaller victories. So we were able to take out also the author of SB 1070 in 2011. That was another sort of like momentum and galvanizing of our communities around the victories that they can actually bring, because at that point in 2011, nobody thought it was possible to take out Russell Pierce, the author of SB 1070. Everybody was like, he's too powerful, he's too hateful, he'll come after us. And when we started doing voter registration within his district, we had the outcome that we didn't actually think possible, but we hoped. So there's always sort of been a discipline of hope and vision and posturing for the long term and building people power to anchor the future.
Köszi, és akkor most Bettyhez fordulunk, aki inkább egy ilyen történeti, vagy ilyen kelet-európai megközelítést fog nekünk adni, és arra kérlek, hogy mondd el nekünk, hogy melyek azok a rendszerváltások a kelet-európai országokban, amik érdekesek lehetnek nekünk amiatt, hogy a mostani Orbán rezsimhez, vagy a nemzeti együttműködés rendszeréhez hasonlóak, viszont ott tudott történni rendszerváltás, és miért?
I'm going to relate to what have been said before me. But before that, we talk about the role of the civic organizations here. But I would like to say that that there are a lot of other factors influencing regime change, and the role of civic organizations is just one of many. For example, the state of the economy, the incumbents' capacity to buy support, to pay the rent seekers, the fragmentation of the authoritarian leadership, the quality of the political institutions and the government's coercive capacity are all equally important when it comes to regime change. And civic organizations should monitor these and should incorporate these into their strategies. And I would like to bring in another factor, or highlight another factor that influences regime change, which is a rather obvious factor, but often underestimated and relates to what have been said to me before. Elections, which are in particular important in authoritarian regimes that share characteristics with the Orbán regime. Elections hold a strategic opportunity not only for political parties but also for civic organizations who don't want to establish a party, they just want to have regime change. And I would like to bring in examples from Eastern Europe, from countries and organizations which used this moment which elections provide strategically for our discussion. But before that, maybe just briefly, let's clarify what kind of regime is the Orbán regime. You might have heard various labels describing the Orbán regime, such as hybrid regime, semi-authoritarian regime, electoral autocracy, or competitive authoritarian regimes are all categories which indicate that there is a centralized regime with a combination of autocratic and democratic features, where formal democratic institutions exist but are abused so that incumbents have a significant advantage over their opponents. And elections are not an exception. There are immense challenges built into the system to make it very difficult to replace the incumbent through elections, such as the manipulation of electoral rules, the manipulation of voters, or campaign financing. However, Hungary is still in the EU, and the elections are still taken seriously. And the question is, why is this an opportunity? Elections are like natural weakness on the shield, because there's a built-in opportunity in the system to generate change through democratic means. And it is also an opportunity to expand mobilization. This is a site to expand mobilization. This is an opportunity for contentious politics, because people would participate anyways. Millions of people consider to participate, to activate themselves in election times. So the question is how other countries and other organizations used this moment strategically to achieve regime change in Eastern Europe. So I would like to bring in a few examples to inspire us. So there are a couple of inspiring examples between 1998 and 2005 in Eastern Europe, in countries which did not fully democratize in the early 90s, but did not remain fully authoritarian either. And thanks to the research of Valerie Bunce and Sharon Wolchik, there are very well-documented cases in these countries, and we know what power structures civic organizations built and how they use this moment. So I would like to bring in a few lessons learned from these examples, and in particular, I would like to highlight Slovakia, where civic organizations were fighting against the regime of Vladimir Mečiar, Serbia in 2000, Slobodan Milošević, and Ukraine in 2004-2005 against the succession from Leonid Kuchma to Viktor Yanukovych. So what are the main lessons learned in these cases? That there is that an aligned civic opposition is exactly as important in these regime changes as a united political opposition. There was a renowned activist called Pavel Demes who said that regime changes are driven by participatory infrastructure, participatory democracy, and political infrastructure. And what made the successful cases different from unsuccessful cases was that there was a network of organizations who have been active in the previous years, built coalitions, worked on issues, but when it came to the elections, they engaged with the electoral moment and ran an ambitious, innovative electoral campaign, which was explicitly anti-regime and ran at scale. So what do I mean by anti-regime? I mean that these civic organizations highlighted issues and visions in a way that they made it clear that they envisioned their future without the authoritarian incumbent. And what do I mean by scale? I mean that these organizations had either a mass organizational base or a mass membership base. And it was an infrastructure of diverse organizations bringing different skills into the game. For example, in Slovakia in 1998, OK 98 was a coalition of 60 NGOs, typically NGO-type organizations, which we all know so well in Hungary. But they ran an ambitious campaign. They communicated their vision to the people and across the country. In Serbia, it was a bit different. You probably all know Otpor, the youth movement, with a membership base of 60,000 people, 100 offices across the country. It's pretty unimaginable in the Hungarian context. But there was also an NGO coalition of Islas 2000, which had 150 NGOs engaging in the elections. And there was also an organization which had expertise in monitoring the elections called Center for Elections and Democracy, which could manage more than 20,000 volunteers. So this is a diverse, interesting infrastructure, and Ukraine offers similar examples. And these organizations also reached out to a wide variety of constituencies. For example, Otpor built alliances with ethnic Hungarians, trade unions, scientists, the church, or pensioners. And OK 98's campaign became a breakthrough when a confederation of unions joined their campaign. And I think, and also an important constituency in these regime changes were the youth. Since Otpor was a youth movement and Pora was a youth movement in Ukraine too, which played a significant role. And it's important to remind ourselves of this, I think, when there will be a demonstration in front of the parliament today at 5, and we all encourage you to join that demonstration, that student and teachers demonstration after the conference. It's never enough to emphasize or remind ourselves of the significance of building coalition between constituencies and putting energy, putting efforts into building a base, especially when we are in Hungary and when we are when Hungarian activists are fighting against a regime which is so well rooted in society. Okay. So how does these civic infrastructures operated? How did these civic infrastructures operate? They drew on analysis pretty much as opposition parties would do. So they, in Slovakia, for example, OK 98 was mobilizing young voters because they measured that young people are less likely to vote, but when they do, they would vote against Mečiar. They did voter outreach. Again, the example from Slovakia, they managed to reach out to 1/3 of all the Slovak settlements and have one-on-one conversations with voters, organized events that concerts or other events with famous artists, etc., etc. Election monitoring was also an important part of these activities, and last but not least, they could train activists at scale. And why are these important now? To wrap up, because there is a huge demonstration going on in front of the parliament very soon, and it's still unclear how these demonstrations are going to lead to a result. And it's also important to remind ourselves that in Hungary we have a lot of this civic infrastructure, what we can see in these other Eastern European countries and Eastern European regime changes. And some of the pillars, some of the components are robust, some of the components are small scale, and some of the components are missing, but it's there. And if we value it, if we think about it, then maybe we will be able to improve it in a way that it leads to a breakthrough.
Köszönöm, és akkor mielőtt egy nagyon gyors lezárókört tennénk, én még... Yeah, I have a question for you. Még Grigorit szeretném kérdezni, hogy ugye itt Alex is választásokról beszélt, Betty is választásokról beszélt. Reflektálnál erre a választások szerepére a rendszerváltásokban, mondjuk Oroszország szempontjából?
Well, I'll try. Well, actually, I would indeed go a little bit deeper on reflecting what has been said already, because apart from elections, I think there was a lot of important things mentioned about a wider coalitions and a bigger outreach. I think, both relating to elections and relating to the general movement. One of the, I think, key lesson learned on the Russian example or Ukrainian example would be, an informal and national-wide and grassroots movements versus institutionalized actors. And I think this is what we observed on the experiences of both Russia, Ukraine, and many other countries, is that in many cases, a grassroots coalitions are more important than the institutionalized actors. Institutionalized actors are important to keep democracy after the regime change happened, but to actual for the D-Day, for the movement, it's more important to have more people engaged, and rather it would be a different kind of forces, rather it would be some very unusual coalitions, but they would be a grassroots, they would have a more people face, they would be able to outreach different kind of communities and different kind of constituencies. And if we got such outreach, then I think with the movement and with elections, we have more possible outcomes. If we're going to talk about the Russian limited experience of electoral successes, but while it's kind of funny, but there was a number of electoral campaigns before the full-scale invasion, which was actually giving hope. Particularly, there was a municipal campaigns both in Moscow and St. Petersburg on so low level. Like in Moscow, that's like a huge city, so there are over 1,000 of municipalities. So there are really a lot of municipal seats in those local parliaments, which was for a long time under the radar. And effective coalition building and effective campaigning on this low level, where you actually, even like it was 2017, 2019, where those actions was happening. That wasn't an easy years already, but even in in a Russian reality, there was a possibility for really big gains on those seats, which was not only, while those seats don't provide too much of the power, CEU was really becoming a school for the social campaigning for the people on the regions, and a very good empowerment tool for a very low-level grassroots politicians from different communities, so they could actually make their first steps. And we saw a lot of cases where those people who just, went to the first ever campaign in their life, just walking door to door by their neighbors, would, grow up to the city-wide known politician in a year or something. Those definitely are inspiring cases. It's like the issue, though, is, we are talking about kind of different level of authoritarian states and its ability to, to commit crimes and repressions. Yeah, so this is because of this, speaking about electoral tools on a different level still have certain limitations, right? But on another side, the one issue why we talk about elections is, well, that's a tool of gaining power, right? But another way why we're speaking about elections, especially low-level elections, is a tool for community building, for empowering your movement, for empowering particular phases of your movement, and for for outreaching to more of the people through more or less common instruments.
Köszönöm, és akkor most fordulok hozzátok. Egy pici késésben vagyunk, de azért még szeretném, hogyha lenne lehetőségetek kérdezni azok, akik most itt ülnek a közönségben, úgyhogy azt kérdezném, hogy van-e valami, amit hozzátennétek, vagy elmondanátok a véleményeteket, vagy kérdeznétek Bettitől, Grigoritól, vagy Alextől, és ha igen, akkor látok ott egy kezet. Még csak azért, hogy lássam, hogy hány érdeklődő van. Van-e még? Pillanat. 2. És nem látom, de ott mutatja valaki, hogy 3. Én nem látom, de ott. Aha, jó, akkor ennyi lesz. Köszi, akkor titeket 3-atokat hallgatunk meg. Bocsánat, csak mit nem látunk, mint látjátok.
Oké, köszi, akkor nevet mondja, Koncz Andi vagyok. Egy sehová nem tartozó, de mindennel foglalkozó önjelölt aktivista, mondjuk így. Ami kérdésem lenne, hogy ha már itt többeteknél fölmerült, hogy nincs mese, létre kell hozni az adott jogi intézményrendszerek, és itt az alatt a pártokat értem, ezeken kívül a civilek köréből, a már létező, különböző szakterületen dolgozó és tudást és tapasztalatot és jövőképet felmutató szervezet létezik, hogy na, belezavarodtam. Szóval ha már ezek vannak, mert rengeteg van, akkor van-e arra részükről szándék, és mindazok, most maradjunk a Közélet Iskolája, mert most itt vagyunk, szándék és lehetőség, hogy ezeket olyan hálózatba kapcsoljuk. Elinduljon egy olyan hálózatba kapcsolódásuk, ami még a részükről semmiféle elköteleződést, hosszú távú elköteleződést nem kíván, de mégis csírája lehet annak, hogy abból valami ilyesmi elinduljon ilyen irányban. Most csak példaként hozom meg az oktatási dialógust, ugye egy szűk szakterületen belül, ahol most már szülők, gyerekek, stb. Szóval, hogy a legkülönbözőbb területen meglévő, már működő civil szervezeteket összehozni. Köszi.
Köszi, és hallgassuk meg a többieket is, szóval egyszerre szedjük össze az összes hozzászólást, kérdést, hogy aztán egyszerre lessen. Azt mondja, itt volt még egy, és aztán ott fönt. Most mind a ketten ugyanabba az irányba mennek. Nem érsz.
Thank you. Listening to you makes one person wonder how we ended up here, that we have to have a conference on this topic. So what I'm worried about, what if we are able to make the change, but then what? Then what we should do in that very feeble and sensitive situation. I would be curious about your thoughts. How should we approach, and I like the approach of the long game. What should we do, what kind of mindset we should have if change happens, to prevent situations like these to happen again when we have to fight for such a change. Thank you.
Köszönöm. És akkor arra kérlek titeket, akik a mikrofonon, hogy próbáljatok velem kommunikálni. Itt volt egy jelentkező, meg ott legfölül. És csak őket tudjuk már meghallgatni, úgyhogy akkor kezdjük ott föl, és itt csak nyújtsd már föl a kezed, létszi, Veronika, köszi, hogy megtaláljon téged a mikrofon, köszi.
Nekem az lenne a kérésem, különösen a külföldről érkezettekhez, mert itt Magyarországon azért elég érzem azt, hogy túlságosan fraktált a társadalom, tehát túlságosan töredezett ahhoz, hogy elérjék a civil szervezetek őket, tehát inkább mondjuk én speciál elég sokáig voltam hajléktalan, és hát ott látom leginkább, hogy a lecsúszások hogy jönnek létre, tehát hogy milyen bántalmazás és hasonló borzalmas emberi helyzetekből kerülnek emberek hajléktalan helyzetbe, anélkül, hogy csak az anyagiakon múlna. Tehát az a problémám, hogy azt szeretném megkérdezni, tehát, hogy például a hölgy, aki Arizonából érkezett, hogy dolgoznak-e azon például, hogy kétnyelvűek legyenek a szavazólapok például, tehát hogy ne legyen probléma az, hogy csak angol nyelvű. Vagy például az Oroszországból érkezett nagyon-nagyon szimpatikus úriember tud-e abban segíteni az anyaországi oroszoknak, hogy szintén a fragmentáltság, tehát a töredezettség miatt minden korosztályból és rétegből minél több emberhez eljussanak az ő tevékenységeik, hiszen én nagyon értem a fiatalok aktivitását, de a közép és idősebb korúakat is épp úgy el lehetne érni, csak kellenek csatornák, ami nagyon működőképes lehet, hiszen mondom, én hajléktalanként láttam, hogy mindenféle társadalmi rétegből akár oda kerülhet az ember. Tehát lehet szervezni őket bármilyen szinten, csak el kell őket érni. Köszönöm szépen.
És akkor itt egy utolsó.
Sziasztok! Én egy nagyon jó módú kerületből jöttem, a második kerületből Budapesten. Az lenne a kérdésem elsősorban Alexhez, mert épp megnéztem, hogy Arizona az ilyen 7,2 milliós térség, tehát 1-2 millióval többen lakunk itt Magyarországon, de azért hasonló a helyzet. És azt szeretném kérdezni, hogy ugye egy nagyon hosszú távú játékról mesél, 12 év munkájáról, és érdekelne, hogy hogyan sikerült azt elérnetek, hogy ebben a 12 évben az a sokféle kicsi megmozdulás a civilektől, civil csoportoktól egy közös memóriává vált össze. Tehát hogy tudtátok megmutatni azoknak az embereknek, akikkel és akikért küzdöttetek, hogy azok a sikerek, amiket lépésenként elértetek, azokat tényleg ők érték el, és tényleg ezek az apró kis lépések, hogy tudtatok erre emlékezni, hogy tudtatok nem elfelejteni, hogy tényleg az azért történt úgy utána, mert mi ezt csináltuk, eltelt megint 4 év, és még emlékszünk rá, hogy tényleg az azért történt. A másik kérdésem az lenne, azért is, mert egy jómódú második kerületből jöttem most ide, hogy kaptatok-e segítséget, támogatást nálatok esetleg jobb helyzetben lévő térségekből ebben szolidaritás, tettleges szolidaritás módon. Köszi.
Köszi, és akkor arra kérlek titeket, hogy válaszoljatok viszonylag röviden, mert kicsit már a szünetben vagyunk. És szerintem Alex kezdje, mert hozzá több kérdés volt, és aztán Greg.
Thank you for the questions. Let's see. It was a lot of questions, so I'm definitely trying to remember. To your question about the long term, I think, for us, we had to focus on the long term and being able to have a North Star that we were building toward. And so we built further than this moment of having Democrats elected. For us, many Democrats show up as neoliberals. And so the end goal is not actually the election. The end goal is being able to build enough leaders so that they can continue building the torch toward the future and building campaigns that resonate with the young leaders. I know when I came into the movement, I thought the movement started when I started, but there was already so much work that had been done before me. And so the thing that I perhaps also should mention now is that Lucha has trained thousands of leaders throughout those 12 years. And so those leaders, some stayed in the movement, some are now chiefs of staff, some are campaign managers, some are fanned out throughout the state. in different political offices. And that's sort of how we're also operating and being able to have an inside-outside game at the different levels of office that matter to us. And so, sort of connected to your question about, you know, how was it that we were able to change the conditions on the voter suppression? It's still a continuous fight. With, you know, with the work, and with any politician also, it's always a negotiation. But we have to be able to create the conditions to come into the negotiation from a place of power with people's voices and real experiences at the center. And what we have done within the organization is we had to take on electoral campaigns in order to change the circumstances that we were experiencing with the systemic voter suppression that was happening within really important, the two most important counties in the state, which was the Tucson area and the Phoenix area, the two main most populous cities in the state, where there was significant attempts and attacks at not allowing our communities to be able to participate in elections. Also sort of connected is when SB 1070 happened in the state, it really was an attack on the Latino community, but what, you know, analysis and more information and understanding the root causes and understanding who the culprits are to the challenges that all of our communities are facing is that we're united in one struggle, often against special corporate interests that are ensuring that all of our voices are not heard. And so we were able to make connections across race, across issue, and understanding often that like our struggles are very much tied together. And so within sort of like the immigrant rights fight, what we very much understand now is that those that are, you know, those entities and the system that is separating and detaining our families are the same systems that are murdering our Black brothers and sisters. And so our fights are very much united. And so what we, you know, have been doing now is a lot of political education to be able to sort of uncover the root causes and the culprits and how each person has agency to be able to not only learn their story, but learn the story of, you know, who are at the center of this and the power that each person as a also collective now within an organization, within a coalition, and within an issue-based structure can do to fight back against that. Not sure.
Yeah. Menjünk tovább a Gregre.
Yeah, just a couple of very short comments. One on languages and the communities. You know, in Germany there is one very unpleasant party called Alternative für Deutschland, or Alternative for Germany, which is famous for it being a European skeptic and far right. They're also famous for outreach in their communities in 6 different languages, because they got a very good support from the Russian Germans, Polish Germans, Turkish Germans, and etc. So they actually print and outreach to the possible electoral base in all sorts of languages. And this is not that complicated, actually, if you work with those communities. So this is like simple, even if like those folks can. Why we can't? And the second answer is on the long term. You know, in Russian context, there are so many people who are rather would think about what we're gonna do once, you know, the regime gonna fail, rather than to try to actually make this regime fail. Then we look sometimes at the very different angle on this. But this is true. For example, in Russia in 1991, when Soviet Union collapsed, there was really lack of understanding how we are, how we change this country. And the economists knew better, politicians knew less. That's what we now see. A very strong central bank, a very weak political institutions. So, yeah, the planning is good.
Betty, te szeretnél reflektálni? És aztán lezárjuk.
In English to the question that came in English. And I'm glad you asked that because time is short and I was cut off a little bit. And it's very important to talk about why it is difficult or why it is problematic to use the elections as a moment of opportunity. In the examples that I brought from these Eastern European regime changes, you might know that these countries took very different trajectories after the regime change. Some of them became rather stable democracies, and some of them went through another cycle of autocratization. And we don't have to go that far, even in the US, working around the elections. And as Alex explained, bringing in new leaders don't necessarily bring the canon. So this just reinforces what we talk about, that having strong, organized communities are very important because our society's natural state is to be disorganized. And a lot of efforts have to go into make them organized. And also, this civic infrastructure is again important in Hungary, where we deal with oftentimes a very unauthentic opposition, or part of the opposition is very unauthentic. And we have seen in the last couple of years, or in the last elections, evidence that when there is strong civic infrastructure that engages with the electoral moment, can transform how the opposition thinks about itself. And that feeds into what the trajectory will be after a possible regime change. És akkor a magyar kérdésre viszont magyarul válaszolok, és így fogom lezárni, mert így már kevésbé zavaró az, hogy egyébként hallanám magam, ahogy fordítanak. Kicsit úgy nehéz lett volna beszélni. Hogy én nagyon örültem annak a kérdésnek, ami ebből az irányból érkezett, mert jó volt hallani azt, hogy neked ennyire magától értetődő, hogy a civil szervezeteknek legyenek azok mozgalmi szervezetek, vagy formálisabb civil szervezetek, de élniük kellene ezzel a lehetőséggel, amit ezek a kis, azok a kis lehetőségek, amit a választások kínálnak. De szeretném azt hangsúlyozni, amit mindannyian tudunk, de jó ezt így szerintem magunknak újra és újra mondani, hogy nem volt mindig magától értetődő, hogy a választásban, mint lehetőségben gondolkodjunk. Noha vannak jó példák az elmúlt 30 év történetéből, de sok szervezet, köztük a Közélet Iskolája is rengeteget tett azért, hogy ez a kultúra, ahogy a civil szervezetek dolgoznak, kapcsolódnak, miben látnak lehetőséget, amikor egy autoritár rezsimben dolgoznak, az változzon. És hogyha végignézzük az elmúlt 13 év történetét, minden ciklusban nagyon más volt ez a választási infrastruktúra, nagyon más volt azoknak a szervezeteknek a felépítése, amelyek valamilyen szinten használták a választást, mint lehetőséget. 2010 és 14 között, 14 és 18 között, 18 és 22 között. Ezen most nincs időnk végigmenni, de az biztos, hogy mostanra egy nagyon érdekes konstelláció állt fel, és szerintem jó lenne erről egyetértek, jó lenne erről tudatosan gondolkozni.
Köszönöm szépen, és nagyon köszönjük nektek, hogy elfogadtátok a meghívást. Most ezzel lezárjuk ezt a beszélgetést.